Okay, so here we are going to talk about the eye. This is the last lecture for this chapter. And the eye is just about as complicated as the ear. So we're going to talk about accessory structures first, and then we're going to get into how the eye communicates to from the retina of the eye, where sensory receptors are located, back to the brain, the visual cortex. So some accessory structures first. You can see the external eye here, like eyelashes. You wouldn't think they're an accessory structure to vision, but they actually help protect. Most of the accessory structures help protect the eye, like the eyelid as well, or palpebrae. Palpebra, which is your upper and lower palpebra, or your eyelids. Between the two, there's a palpebral fissure. So that fissure is an opening between two eyelids where your eyeball is located, and you can actually see light gets into your eye through that. At each edge is called a medial canthus and a lateral canthus. That's basically where the two eyelids, palpebra, come together. And there's a little structure called a lacrimal caruncle. So we'll learn here shortly that the lacrimal gland produces tears, and it produces tears from over here, kind of superior and lateral in the eye, and tears wash across the eye into this lateral lacrimal caruncle, where tears collect and then head into, or actually out of the eye. Conjunctiva. If you've ever had an eye infection, you've had conjunctivitis, and I wouldn't be doing my job as a teacher if I didn't get to show you some gross pictures today. So I'm going to show you a picture of conjunctivitis soon. Basically, the conjunctiva are a mucous membrane that's covered by stratified squamous epithelium, and it lines the inner surfaces of the eyelids, so the palpebra, and the outer surface of the eye too. So stratified squamous epithelium, remember, its major job is to protect. So it's actually lining the surface of the eye that you can see. There's a layer of stratified squamous epithelium that you actually look through, that light passes through to get back into the eye, but it protects that outer surface. That outer clear surface is called the cornea, and that epithelial tissue covers the surface of the cornea, but it's transparent on the anterior surface. You can see right through it. In the conjunctiva, there's also what's called tarsal glands, or meibomian glands. These glands are in the inner margin of the eyelid, and they secrete this kind of fatty lipid-rich substance that keeps the eyelids from sticking together. So take a look. This pink layer is the conjunctiva. Tarsal glands are located in here. Again, they secrete a lipid kind of fatty substance that lubricates these eyelids and keeps them from sticking together. And this is the cornea here, this layer, right? This is the cornea, and it's covered by the conjunctiva. That's basically a layer of epithelial tissue there. Take a look at that. So here's conjunctivitis. When an eye infection occurs, it's also called pink eye. So it's basically from damage or irritation of the conjunctival surface. Anything with itis at the end is an inflammation. Basically redness from dilated blood vessels. And it's usually caused by some kind of pathogen, bacteria or virus, basically, or an allergy maybe, or some kind of chemical irritation. Tears are produced by the lacrimal gland, mentioned that earlier. They basically reduce friction as you blink your eyes, remove debris, and there's actually an enzyme called a lysozyme that prevents bacterial infection. So this fluid that makes up your tears is really protective of your eye, and it also provides nutrients and oxygen to the conjunctival epithelium. Remember, epithelial tissue, if you don't remember, is avascular, so it needs to receive nutrients and oxygen from other sources. The source that this receives it from is tears. And the lacrimal apparatus is basically a group of structures that either produce tears, move tears, or drain tears to or from the eye. So the lacrimal gland is where tears are produced. They're sent to the eye and delivered to the eye by tear ducts. And then the lacrimal, there's little structures called lacrimal canaliculi, little tiny canals that basically drain tears from the eye and send them into the lacrimal sac, which is what collects tears and sends them through the nasolacrimal duct and into the nasal cavity. So take a look at this. Whenever you cry, you ever get a sniffly nose, right? And that sniffy nose or sniffly nose is because tears are produced here in the lacrimal gland, sent through the tear ducts into the eye. You blink and wash the eyes across, down, and medially to the lacrimal puncta, there's openings here into the lacrimal canaliculi, these little canals that tears drain into the lacrimal sac. And then the nasolacrimal duct carries those tears into your nasal cavity, just below the inferior basically the inferior, there's a nasal conchae, right? So there's the inferior meatus. So those tears are basically produced and washed across the eye and then drained from the eye into the nasal cavity. So when you cry and you have an excess of tear production, you get a sniffly nose because all those tears are draining right into your nasal cavity. Now, so those are mostly accessory structures. We're going to talk about the layers. There's 3 major layers of the eye that make up the wall of the eye, because the inner eye is really just made up of cavities with fluid inside. So that those cavities are created by these 3 layers. There's a fibrous outer layer that consists of two structures, but it's all one continuous layer, the cornea and the sclera. There's 2 different sections of this outer fibrous layer because the cornea is basically you can see through it, it's clear, and the sclera is not, and they're located in different areas, but they are the same layer. It basically provides support and protection for the inner components of the eye, where the sensory receptors are located. It's also a point of attachment for the extrinsic eye muscles, those muscles that move your eyeball. And it contains the cornea, which allows light to pass into the eye and actually hit the retina, where the sensory receptors are located. So take a look. Right here's the cornea. This layer here continues as the sclera, and it's like the white. If you look at your eye in the mirror, you can see the white of your eye. The white of your eye is basically the sclera, and it surrounds the entire eye here and actually kind of surrounds the optic nerve as well. But it's continuous. This layer is continuous with the cornea. So it's the same layer, but this is opaque, can't see through it, and this is clear. The vascular layer is deep to the fibrous layer. So just underneath the fibrous layer is called the choroid. So this vascular layer has a couple of components. The choroid has a bunch of blood vessels, and it's just underneath the sclera. So the choroid is kind of posterior to where you would see the cornea. The iris basically also contains blood vessels, but also smooth muscles, and that controls the diameter of the pupil. And the pupil is just the hole through the eye that light passes through, and it can constrict and dilate. So if you go into a room and look into a mirror and flip on the lights, you'll see the pupils constrict. Or if you turn the lights off, you can still see the pupil, they'll dilate. So it regulates how much light is allowed to enter the eye. And then within that choroid layer is also called the ciliary body. And the ciliary body has smooth muscle that connects to the lens. And the lens is basically like lenses in your glasses. But the lens can change shape to focus light back onto the retina, so you see a clear image. We're going to continue to talk about that. So take a look here. Where is it pointed out on here? Here's the choroid is the middle layer. So there's 1 layer, 2 layers, 3 layers. The inner layer we'll talk about next, but this middle layer is the choroid, where blood vessels, mostly blood vessels that supply blood to the eye, are located. The ciliary body is here. Remember I said the ciliary body has smooth muscle that connects to the lens. Right here's the lens that changes shape, so that as light makes its way, follow my cursor, light makes its way into the eye. The lens basically bends it and sends it back to the retina. So this vascular layer contains the choroid that's continuous with the ciliary body, where there's smooth muscle that changes the shape of the lens. And then it's continuous with the iris here, and the iris is where you have your eye color, but there's smooth muscle there that changes the shape of the pupil. And the pupil is just the hole. Basically from here to here is the pupil. It's the opening or the hole through the iris that allows light to pass through the cornea, through the pupil, and then through the lens to get bent back to the retina. And the retina is the neural layer of the eye, where there's sensory receptors. And there's two major layers of the retina. The pigmented layer basically absorbs light as it makes its way into the eye, and the neural layer, where the sensory receptors called photoreceptors are located. So here's the neural layer. This is the retina, this kind of pinkish color in here. So 3 layers: the fibrous layer with the sclera and the cornea, basically sclera, then cornea. The vascular layer, where there's blood vessels. Remember, vascular is blood vessels. There's choroid, ciliary body, iris. And then the neural layer, which is the retina. Those 3 layers create cavities inside the eye. And there's basically a smaller anterior cavity and a posterior cavity. There's 2 different types of fluid. In the anterior cavity, there's called aqueous humor. In the posterior cavity, there's called vitreous humor, or the vitreous body. It's a jelly-like substance that's fluid, but it helps basically like hold the shape of the eye internally. Let's take a look. Here's the cornea. From the lens to the cornea is the anterior cavity. There's aqueous humor in here. And behind the lens, all the way to the retina, is the posterior cavity. So this is a space where there's vitreous humor, or the vitreous body, that gelatinous-like substance. And the eye muscles, remember, they connect to the fibrous layer of the eye, the sclera. There's 6 of them, and they're listed here. And which cranial nerves control them? Remember, there's 3 cranial nerves that control the extrinsic muscles of the eye. I said we'd come back to them now. So here we go. The oculomotor nerve, I mentioned before when we talked about cranial nerves, innervates and controls 4 of the 6 extrinsic eye muscles. The superior rectus, we'll point these out on the next slide. The inferior rectus, the medial rectus, remember a rectus muscle is long and straight, the fibers all run in one direction, and then the inferior oblique muscle. The lateral rectus is controlled by the trochlear nerve, and the superior oblique is controlled by the trochlear nerve. So there's 2, I think I said 3. There's 2 cranial nerves that control the extrinsic eye muscles. A third cranial nerve, the optic nerve, innervates the eye. So we talked about 3 or 4. I did say that wrong. This is listed wrong here. I'm going to fix it while we're talking about this. Cranial nerve 6 is the abducens, not the trochlear nerve. Sorry about that, guys. So I fixed it. I'm saving it, and then we're going to move on once it lets me. So I'll keep moving on while it's saving it. There we go. And then I will fix the notes as well and post those hopefully before you can see this. So superior oblique is innervated by the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4, superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus. 3 of the 4 rectus muscles in the inferior oblique are controlled by the oculomotor, and then the lateral rectus is controlled by the abducens. So take a look. And this is the eye. You're looking at it kind of from the sagittal section. Right here's the optic nerve. You've got these listed here. So right here, there's 4 rectus muscles, 4 long, straight muscles. The superior rectus, lateral rectus, inferior rectus, and you can't really see the medial rectus. It's on the medial side of the eye, but it's basically on the opposite side of this one here, but medially instead of laterally. Look at where they originate on the sclera, the white part of the eye. So think about this muscle when it contracts. When this muscle contracts and pulls back to where the origin is located, your eyeball would look towards us. Or if the medial rectus, if you do something for me, cross your eyes. If you look towards your nose, you cross your eyes. That's your medial rectus in both eyes, pulling your eyeball to try to look in towards your nose. So these muscles, take a look here. There's another the other side. So this is the medial rectus, right? There's a superior oblique. Take a look at what it does. Superior oblique has this little notch here of connective tissue that the ligament, or the tendon runs through and connects to the eye. And the inferior oblique, you can see on the other picture. This is the movements of the eye, right? So the superior oblique muscle rolls the eye. So superior and inferior oblique. I'm going to flip back here. Look at their attachments. So right here's the inferior oblique. So it attaches just underneath the lateral rectus here, and it'll pull in this direction on the eye. So let's go back here and think the superior and inferior oblique, they roll the eye. So think kind of like rotating it, but also can look down and out laterally. The inferior oblique looks up and out laterally. And then the lateral rectus, you look laterally, so look to one side. The inferior rectus, look down. Superior rectus, look up. And the medial rectus, look medially, so cross your eyes, right? So if you look to the right with both eyes, so look to your right without turning your head, you'll use the lateral rectus in your right eye and the medial rectus in your left eye to look right. Think about that. Do those movements and think about what muscles you're using, right? So here's the figure of showing you kind of what those movements would be. Okay, so organization of this eye anatomy. So we kind of talked about the anatomy of the eye up until now. The cornea allows light to enter the eye. So have a figure of the cross section of the eye while you're looking at, while we're talking about this. The cornea allows light to enter the eye. The lens, basically held in place by the ciliary body and some ligaments that attach to it, bends light as it makes its way through and back to the retina that contains the photoreceptors or sensory receptors. And then that which makes up the neural layer of the eye. And then the choroid contains blood vessels, and the sclera is dense fibrous connective tissue that protects and keeps the shape of the eye. Cool, right? So right here is so this is basically light enters through the cornea, heads through the lens that can change shape depending on the ciliary muscle, the muscle in the ciliary body here, and then light passes through to the retina. There's the choroid layer and the sclera that are vascular choroid layer, and the sclera is the protective layer. All of that is there to create this visual axis that light passes through the center of the cornea, enters the center of the lens to and then is bent, basically sent back to a specific location on the retina. It's basically an imaginary line called the visual axis, where there's a high concentration of photoreceptors in one area of the retina, and all light is basically focused on that one point. And information from that one point is sent to the optic nerve. So take a look on this side. So right here's the visual axis. Light enters the cornea through the lens back to that one point. It's called the macula fovea on the retina, and that is where there's a really high concentration of photoreceptors, and those receptors send information to the optic nerve and back to the brain. To change how much light is allowed into the eye back to the retina, you have the pupil, and it's surrounded by the iris. The iris has 2 layers of smooth muscle that can control the shape of the pupil. So whether it's constricted and small or dilated and large. So the pupillary dilator muscle dilates the iris or dilates the pupil, and the pupillary constrictor muscle constricts the pupil. And then, so basically, and they're activated by 2 different autonomic nervous systems. The dilator muscles are stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system, and the constrictor muscles are stimulated by the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is what I want you to do. I'm going to just pause the video and go into a room where there's a mirror and a light switch nearby. I want you to look into the mirror, or have somebody near you. You can look into each other's eyes. So have a partner and look into each other's eyes, and turn the lights off for a period of time, but keep looking into each other's eyes and watch the pupils dilate. And then suddenly turn the lights on, but keep watching your partner, keep looking in the mirror, and watch your pupils constrict. Those 2 muscles are working to do that. So flip the lights on, and the pupillary constrictor muscle will contract and decrease the size of the pupil. So it'll look like this. And then turn the lights off so that you can still see the size of the pupil, and the pupillary constrictor muscle will relax, but the pupillary dilator muscle will constrict and pull out on the pupil and dilate it. That's a fun activity. So light, as it passes through the cornea and it basically makes its way to the lens. The lens's job is to change shape based on the muscles that are pulling on it to refract or bend light as it passes through the lens and is sent back to the retina. So these light rays are refracted by the cornea a little bit, and then there's additional refraction as it passes through the lens. And the lens can change how much the light is refracted by changing shape. So the lens basically provides this refraction to focus light at one focal point on the retina, depending on the distance between the lens and the focal point. So basically the distance between the lens where light hits it and is sent back to the focal point is focal distance. Take a look. Light from a distant source. So if you're looking at like something far off, the lens is kind of flattened and a whole bunch of refraction occurs this is the lens here. So it's flattened. And then as light passes through, that light gets refracted or bent to one single point. And as long as it's at one single point, you see a clear image. From a close source, the lens changes shape to refract light even more to that same focal point, but the focal distance increases from the lens to the focal point. So basically, the closer the light source, the longer the focal distance. Which means the lens is pretty flat. As the lens rounds, so the muscles stop pulling on the lens rounds out, there's a shorter focal distance. So the lens can change shape from flat, close light source, to round, distant light source, to change the focal distance and maintain the same focal point. Okay, so parts of the retina that are really important. The pigmented part, that absorbs light. Actually, light passes through the neural part of the retina first, and light gets absorbed by the pigmented part of the retina, where there's photoreceptors in the outermost layer closest to the pigmented part. There's a couple of other cells called ganglion cells that are the innermost layer, and where there's an optic disc on the part of the retina, that's basically where the optic nerve is leaving the eye, and that's also called your blind spot. So the optic disc, there's no photoreceptors located there. There's just axons of ganglion cells that converge to form the optic nerve. And that optic disc, there's no photoreceptors, so that creates your blind spot. That blind spot's right here. So these are all axons of ganglion cells converging to create the optic nerve. So this whole area here is your blind spot. So this down here is the pigmented portion of the retina. And this layer of cells would be photoreceptors. Up here, there's ganglion cells, and their axons converge to the optic nerve. There's another layer of cells we'll talk about next. So there's actually 3 layers of cells that communicate from the photoreceptors to the optic nerve. So right there's your optic disc. That's where the optic nerve leaves your eye. This is what your optometrist sees when he's looking through your eye with that big shiny light and asks you to keep your eyes open. This fovea here, the macula fovea, is basically the area where there's a really high concentration of photoreceptors. So that would be like the focal point in the retina. And the photoreceptors in the neural layer of the retina, there's 2 different types so that you can see different types of light. There's rods and cones, and the rods are better at detecting black and white and shades of gray vision and dim light, whereas the cones are much better at detecting and much more sensitive to bright light and color vision. So think cones, they detect color and bright light. Bipolar cells are not photoreceptors, but they are the cells that communicate from the photoreceptors, the rods and the cones, to ganglion cells. So they're a connection between the photoreceptors and ganglion cells. So take a look. If you cross-section it, here's the pigmented portion of the retina, and right here are rods and cones, photoreceptors. So these would be the cones right here, or cones here and rods here. They look like a rod versus a cone, right? These are bipolar cells that communicate from photoreceptors to the ganglion cells, and the ganglion cell axons create the optic nerve. Actually, I'm going to stay here really quickly because I want to point out one more thing. Light passes. So right here is the posterior cavity. Light passes through the neural portion of the retina and is absorbed by the pigmented portion of the retina, and that's what stimulates photoreceptors and activates them. So let's talk about how that happens. So light strikes the visual pigment, and there's a retinal molecule that changes shape. We're not going to talk much about that because it's a little complicated, but we are going to talk about how light passes through and how communication occurs between these cells. That basically changes the permeability of the membrane of the photoreceptor to ions. So ions are allowed to diffuse into the cell and depolarize the photoreceptor. And that basically converts that light energy into an action potential. So take a look. Right here's the photoreceptor. Light passes in this direction and activates this photoreceptor. So here's part that's kind of, we're just going to gloss over a little bit. So a photon of light hits this photoreceptor and it's absorbed, and it changes the shape of some intracellular proteins that basically activates this photoreceptor, but changes the membrane of this photoreceptor's permeability to ions, and positive ions start to diffuse into the cell, depolarize that cell, and generate an action potential that's then basically communicated by way of neurotransmitter to the bipolar cell, stimulating the bipolar cell to generate another action potential. And that bipolar cell then releases neurotransmitter to communicate to the ganglion cell, which also generates an action potential. And that action potential is sent all the way back to the brain. And here's the pathway that it takes. So visual fields, basically your eyes receive information. The retina is activated to generate action potentials. And then here's the optic nerve that carries, remember that the crossing of the optic nerves is at the optic chiasm. So the optic nerves communicate to the optic chiasm, whereas some of the axons cross to the opposite side in that nerve, but other of the axons stay on the same side. These portions of the optic nerve are called the optic tract, and they carry action potentials all the way back to a particular area of the brain. We're not going to talk about what that area is, but that area is back in the brain. It's basically part of the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is a relay center, so we're going to talk about maybe just the thalamus. Let's call it that for right now, because it's a specific area of the thalamus. And then the thalamus communicates all the way back to the visual cortex, which is located in the occipital lobe of the brain. So this whole pathway starts from light entering the cornea, through the lens, gets refracted back to the retina. The retina then generates action potentials through the three types of cells we talked about: photoreceptors, my slide slid forward, photoreceptors, bipolar cells, and ganglion cells. And the ganglion cells take all that communication by way of their axons and send them all the way back to the thalamus. The thalamus then takes that communication and sends it back to the visual cortex. So complicated pathways, but really cool. And that finishes for us chapter 9. So I will see you in chapter 10.